The grand ballroom of the Lancaster Hotel was bathed in golden light, its chandeliers casting a soft glow over the sea of elegantly dressed guests. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged wine, and freshly polished mahogany. It was a night of opulence, an annual charity gala attended by the city's most influential elites. Conversations were lively, laughter filled the air, and glasses clinked as servers moved swiftly between the tables, ensuring no guest was left wanting. Among these servers was Daniel Carter, a young black man with a quiet presence and a strong work ethic. Dressed in the standard black and white uniform, he carried a silver tray with the ease of experience, carefully placing glasses of champagne on the tables of some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in attendance. Daniel wasn't supposed to be here. Not really. He was a musician, a pianist with a deep passion for jazz and classical music. But talent didn't always pay the bills, and tonight, he was just another face in the background, another worker whose presence was acknowledged only when needed. At one of the grandest tables near the stage sat Victoria Lancaster, a woman whose wealth and influence were rivaled only by her vanity. With diamond earrings that shimmered under the warm lighting and a gown that looked like it had been stitched from the night sky itself, she commanded attention without even trying. But beneath her carefully curated elegance lay a sharp tongue and a cruel sense of humor, especially toward those she deemed beneath her. As Daniel approached her table to refill a guest's glass, he could feel Victoria's scrutinizing gaze land on him. She barely concealed her distaste, her manicured fingers twirling the stem of her wine glass. "Careful there," she said in a voice dripping with condescension as Daniel poured. "Wouldn't want to stain something that costs more than your yearly salary." A few people at her table chuckled, though some exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel didn't flinch. He had dealt with people like Victoria before, entitled, arrogant, and eager to remind others of their perceived place in the world. He simply nodded politely, murmured a soft, "Of course, ma'am," and moved on. But that wasn't the end of it. A moment later, another waiter, Daniel's friend, Miguel, accidentally bumped into Victoria's chair while rushing past with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. It was a minor misstep, but for someone like Victoria, it was unforgivable. She gasped dramatically, turning sharply toward the waitstaff. "Honestly, does the hotel just let anyone work these events now?" Her voice was loud enough to turn heads. Miguel immediately apologized, his face turning red, but Victoria wasn't done. Her eyes flickered to Daniel, who had just stopped at the next table. "You," she called out, her lips curling into a smirk. "Since you're already here, why don't you entertain us? Play something on the piano for the guests." First, Daniel thought he had misheard her. He turned slightly, his brows furrowing. "Excuse me?" Victoria's smirk deepened. "The piano." She gestured toward the magnificent Steinway grand piano positioned near the stage. "You can play, can't you? I mean, all of you love jazz, right?" A hush fell over the nearby tables. Some guests exchanged uncertain looks, realizing the undercurrent of mockery in her voice. Daniel stood frozen, a mixture of emotions flooding him. He loved playing. Music was his life. But this wasn't an invitation, it was a test, a game, a joke at his expense. Victoria wasn't offering him a moment in the spotlight out of kindness. She was daring him to embarrass himself, to reinforce whatever twisted stereotype she had in her mind. He glanced at Miguel, who gave him a subtle, encouraging nod. He could also feel the weight of the other guests' gazes, some curious, some uncomfortable, and a select few eager to see him fail. For a moment, Daniel considered refusing. He could simply shake his head and walk away, let Victoria revel in her petty victory. But then, something inside him shifted, a quiet defiance, a need to prove that he was more than what she saw. So, with a deep breath, he set down his tray, adjusted his sleeves, and turned toward the grand piano. The room held its breath. Would this waiter, this man Victoria so clearly saw as insignificant, surprise them all? A hush fell over the grand ballroom as Daniel Carter stepped toward the Steinway grand piano. His polished black shoes echoed softly against the marble floor, the weight of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of gazes pressing against his back. He could feel it, that mix of curiosity and condescension, the unspoken expectation that he would fail. At the table near the stage, Victoria Lancaster leaned back into her chair, swirling her wine with a satisfied smirk. To her, this was just another moment of amusement, an opportunity to remind the world of its hierarchy, to revel in the awkward humiliation of a mere waiter. Daniel reached the piano and exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering just above the pristine ivory keys. It had been months since he had played on an instrument this magnificent. The last time was during an audition for a scholarship, one he had been rejected for, not because of his talent, but because the judges didn't believe a young black man belonged in their esteemed classical program. Tonight, however, there were no judges, only the sneers of the wealthy elite and the watchful eyes of those who hoped, perhaps secretly, that he would prove them wrong. A brief pause, and then he began to play. The moment the first note rang out, the room changed. His fingers moved with a confidence that stunned the audience. The melody that poured from the piano was neither timid nor hesitant. It was bold, powerful, and rich with emotion. It wasn't some simple, uninspired piece meant to entertain party guests. It was a composition that commanded attention. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Daniel transitioned from a soulful jazz introduction into a classical masterpiece, seamlessly blending the styles in a way that only a true virtuoso could. His hands flew across the keys with breathtaking precision, his body moving with the rhythm as if the music were flowing through him. A group of musicians in the audience, including a world-renowned pianist, sat frozen in shock. This was no amateur. This was someone with a level of skill that belonged in Carnegie Hall, not behind a serving tray. At her table, Victoria's smirk had vanished. Her fingers, once lazily twirling the stem of her wine glass, now gripped it tightly. Her confident amusement had turned into disbelief, her cheeks growing red as she realized that her cruel little joke had backfired spectacularly. The room, once filled with murmurs and whispers, now stood in absolute silence, every soul captivated by the music that swelled through the grand hall. And then the crescendo. Daniel ended with a flourish, his fingers gliding over the last set of notes before the final chord resonated through the room. The silence that followed was not one of awkwardness, but of sheer awe. And then thunderous applause. It started with a few claps, then a dozen. Then the entire ballroom erupted into applause, cheers, and even whistles. Some stood from their seats, offering an ovation that Victoria Lancaster had never received at any of her lavish events. People rushed forward to speak to him. "Where did you learn to play like that? Who are you? You're incredible. Have you played professionally?" Daniel, still seated at the piano, simply smiled humbly. He wasn't playing for their approval. He had played because the music was in him, because it was his passion, and because no amount of wealth or status could take that away from him. Victoria sat, silent, her face flushed with embarrassment. The very people who had laughed along with her moments ago were now ignoring her, eager to shower praise on the very man she had intended to humiliate. And in that moment, she realized the tables had turned. The applause still echoed through the grand ballroom, but Daniel Carter remained composed. He wasn't basking in the praise, nor did he throw gloating glances toward Victoria Lancaster. Instead, he simply bowed his head in quiet gratitude, the way a true artist does, one who plays for the love of music rather than for validation. But the power in the room had shifted. A well-dressed older man, a guest who had barely given Daniel a second glance when he was serving tables, now rushed forward, his face beaming with admiration. "That was magnificent," the man stammered, shaking Daniel's hand. "Where have you been hiding, young man? Have you performed in London? New York? You must have studied at Juilliard? Or perhaps the Paris Conservatoire?" Daniel smiled, shaking his head. "No, sir. I never had the opportunity." A hush rippled through the nearby crowd. "No opportunity?" A woman in an emerald gown gasped. "But your talent. How could they not see it?" Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line, a familiar sting surfacing in his chest. He didn't need to explain. People like these, the privileged, the powerful, had always controlled who was allowed to succeed in their world and who wasn't. They had built barriers, invisible yet firm, ones he had spent his whole life trying to break through. And yet, here he was, forcing them to listen. "Mr. Carter," a tall, authoritative voice called from the crowd. A distinguished silver-haired gentleman emerged, one Daniel immediately recognized, Nathaniel Blackwood, a legendary music producer who had launched some of the world's greatest pianists. Nathaniel eyed him, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he extended a hand. "I want to offer you an audition," he said simply. "If you'll accept it." Gasps fluttered through the audience. An audition with Nathaniel Blackwood was a golden ticket, a chance at the kind of career that most musicians could only dream of. Daniel's heart pounded. This wasn't something he had expected, nor did he ever imagine a night like this could change his life in an instant. But before he could answer, a wine glass shattered. All heads snapped toward Victoria Lancaster. Her delicate fingers trembled, the remnants of red wine dripping onto the pristine white tablecloth. Her face was pale, her jaw set tight. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. Victoria was the queen of this social circle, the one everyone envied and admired. And yet, within moments, the spotlight had turned away from her and landed directly on the man she had tried to humiliate. Her lips curled into a strained smile as she finally spoke. "Well," she said, lifting her chin, "I suppose we should be thankful for unexpected entertainment." The room tensed. It was a subtle dig, but everyone heard it. A last attempt to regain control, to put Daniel back in his place. Daniel, however, remained calm. He had spent his whole life dealing with people like her. People who hated losing, especially to someone they deemed beneath them. He turned toward Victoria, meeting her gaze. "I wasn't playing to entertain you, Ms. Lancaster," he said softly, but his words carried weight. "I was playing because music speaks louder than privilege ever could." A collective hush fell over the room. Victoria's cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth as if to retaliate, but no words came. The audience understood. For the first time in her life, Victoria Lancaster had lost. Daniel turned back to Nathaniel Blackwood, his resolve firm. "I'll take that audition, sir," he said, his voice steady. "And I'll make sure you never forget it." Blackwood grinned. "I expect nothing less." The room erupted into cheers once more. But this time, it wasn't just for the music. It was for the underdog who had won the night. Victoria Lancaster, meanwhile, sat in silence, staring at the shattered glass in front of her. For the first time, she was the one being ignored. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People surrounded Daniel, shaking his hand, offering words of admiration, and sharing stories of how his music had touched them. The man who had started the night as a waiter had become the most important person in the room. Victoria Lancaster, however, remained quiet. She had been completely dethroned, stripped of her power in the very arena where she once reigned. But Daniel wasn't thinking about her anymore. His mind was already elsewhere, racing ahead to the future. A week later, Daniel stood outside the grand doors of Nathaniel Blackwood's private concert hall. He took a deep breath. This was it. The audition room was stunning. A golden-lit stage, a flawless grand piano at its center. Blackwood sat in the front row, accompanied by several high-profile producers and music directors. Daniel stepped forward, placed his hands on the keys, and let go. He played not for fame, not for money, but for the love of music itself. Every note carried his story, his struggles, his resilience, his triumph over people like Victoria Lancaster. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, thunderous applause. Nathaniel Blackwood stood, clapping. "That," he said, "was one of the most breathtaking performances I have ever heard." He turned to his panel. "Gentlemen, I think we've just found the next great pianist." Daniel's heart swelled. This was more than just an opportunity. It was the moment that changed everything. Back in her mansion, Victoria Lancaster scrolled through her phone, jaw clenched. Every social media platform was flooded with articles about Daniel's success. From waiter to world-class pianist, Daniel Carter's astonishing journey. Humiliated by her own game, how Victoria Lancaster lost the spotlight. Her fingers tightened around the glass in her hand. she had tried to mock him. Instead, she had unknowingly given him the stage he deserved. And now, the world had forgotten her. Months later, Daniel stepped onto the Carnegie Hall stage for his first major performance. The audience was packed. Some had come out of sheer curiosity, others because they had heard whispers of his talent. The lights dimmed. He placed his hands on the piano. This time, there was no hesitation, no fear. As his fingers glided over the keys, the music told his story once again. But this time, the whole world was listening, and nobody was laughing anymore. Daniel Carter's story wasn't just about talent. It was about resilience, about rising above cruelty and proving that true worth cannot be determined by wealth or privilege. Victoria Lancaster had tried to tear him down, but in doing so, she had become a mere footnote in his success story. And as Daniel took his final bow that night, he knew this was only the beginning. If you love stories about justice, redemption, and unexpected triumphs, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Let us know in the comments what you think of Daniel's journey.